My name is Lola Akingbade. I'm a third-year behavioral neuroscience major, engaged heavily in issues of race and justice on campus. Today I'll be discussing Black identity as it relates to change in communities of color. So this is me 2 weeks ago in Selma. I was there for a civil rights service trip, engaged in issues of voting rights and understanding the history of the civil rights movement. I like to note that I'm standing on the roof of a 6-story building, the tallest building in all of Selma. Now, it took a lot for me to get up there. I had to climb from a ladder leading from the floor below. And oddly enough, on the year I attended the trip, the year prior, I had refused to go on the roof, despite the cheers from my classmates and the promise of a great view. So going on the roof this year had me question what got me there and what in that moment had been so different. So here's my start. I came to Northeastern with more than an admissions ticket, but a full tuition scholarship to the university. And this has allowed me a degree of freedom in terms of what I've engaged in my major and other issues on campus. And when I came to college and transitioned into sophomore year, I was very much engaged in understanding who I was. And the first question I kind of had was what did these issues around me in the country, so the deaths I was seeing in terms of the death of Mike Brown, the death of Rekia Boyd, the death of many African-American members of the community, how did that impact me? So this is me in November of 2014, after the non-indictment of Officer Darren Wilson, the Ferguson police officer who killed Mike Brown in August of that year. It was a lot. Aside from going through academic struggles like organic chemistry, having the personal struggle of dealing with the onset of these nationalized deaths really impacted me. And I remember that night of the non-indictment, I received a call from the director of my scholarship program, Dr. Iacono, who called an allyship to see if I was okay, as I was very active on Twitter and still am today. And on Twitter, I was using it as a space to discuss these issues and really vent about how I felt media was misconstruing the image of protesters as being uncivilized and unjust in their understanding of what was going on. And I cried. I said things I cannot remember for a length of time. I do not recall. But I do remember the last thing I did say to her on the phone. I said I wanted to do a SURF. See, a SURF is a scholarship-funded grant that allows you to explore any independent topic of your choosing. I don't know in that moment why, out of all my anger and frustration, my first thought was to engage in academic inquiry on the topic of race and citizenship in Ferguson. But thinking back to where I am and where I've been at my time at Northeastern, being so enveloped in an academic environment, I very much saw scholarship as a way to cope with the world around me. I saw delineating the truths of the world as a basis for understanding. And things didn't come so quickly. So I reached out to a faculty mentor on campus, Dr. Sarah Janelle Jackson, who teaches about communication studies and race and how it intersects with gender. And having these ideas and being so boldly impacted by this, I sat down over that past spring, spring of 2015, and wrote down my ideas. And through that, was able to get institutional review funding through the university, as well as approval to travel to Ferguson and St. Louis in that May and June of the year. So before I went, I very much engaged in the issues and understanding the different economic barriers that separated the north side of St. Louis, a predominantly African-American part of the region, from the south side of St. Louis, where you have high-power institutions such as Washington University in St. Louis and the other economic disparities that existed there. And for me, I wanted to engage with the Black voice, so members of the community who were deeply invested in issues of social change, inclusive of nonprofit leaders, community organizers, concerned citizens, anyone who's engaged in these issues only identified and collected under this understanding of Black identity. So I met them through protest, through talks, and very much wanted to see who was engaged in these issues. Through that, for me, the best way to explore both voices and understanding of these issues was through creating a website. So after my return to Northeastern, I created the blackvoicesproject.com, an infographic website which allowed me to not only display images of the individuals, but also the voices through individual stories. So through this, my website served as a space for understanding the narratives, and I was very much able to, as a collective, underscore how policing had impacted this community and what perspectives for, and what perspectives they saw as the change that was needed in these communities. Policing, the desire was to have community-based policing. So having police officers live and work in the communities they serve was essentially what community members wanted, and also having the idea of civilian review, so having African American members of the community involved in the hiring, firing, and review of all police officers in a community. And on the idea of what needed to change in terms of politics, there was two schools of thought, that of reform and radicalism. So having Black independence fostering this idea of Black nationalism through looking inward and being less reliant on the systems that oppress you, but also having reform through having more elected officials of color. So I was really able to underscore that as well, the driving forces behind civil unrest through dialogue with the communities. But aside from just the narrative of the collective, I was able to delineate and understanding the forces behind protesting and the reason that outrage happened in August and November 2014. What's more powerful for me is the change I got through the individual stories. So sitting down with people and hearing what they had to say, and not just looking at it from an analytical standpoint across all the differences in the interviews. So here's one story. This is Tony Taylor. I met her in May of 2015 at a protest for the death of Von Derek Myers, 18-year-old Ferguson teenager who was killed and shot by a St. Louis police officer in October of the previous year. And Ferguson members of the community have flocked down to City Hall after there was no charges for the killing of Von Derek Myers, and Tony was very active in this pursuit. And she saw me. I was mostly behind the camera most of the time covering the protest, but afterward she actually gave me a ride because the protest was moved to a different location, and asked who I was, and I try to maintain the balance between goodwill and proactiveness as a researcher, and sat down with her some weeks later after the protest. For her, Ferguson was an eye-opener. She very much discussed this idea of courage that she got out of this movement. See, Tony lost her son in 2013 to police violence. Her son, Kerry Ball, was shot 25 times in 2013. And since then, 3 years later, she's been fighting for justice still. She has a lawsuit out against the St. Louis Police Department and is still fighting for it despite people still leaving her side and people not wanting to get involved. And on the topic of courage, she emphasized how a big struggle was that many members of the community did not want to get involved. They didn't want this coming back to them. They would stand for a picture, an image for a protest, but when it came down to going to the courts, no one wanted to support her on her side. And that very much emphasized the connection I saw with Selma, seeing how continuously the threat of, also she mentioned the threat of losing her job, that was a threat that was that has been against many protesters in the history of this country, seeing the idea that the civil rights movement was a women and children-led movement because those who were out working in the in corporations or jobs would lose their jobs from their participation in the movement. So that was something that really underscored the connection I had with Selma and Ferguson. And on policing, she saw the idea of having protect and serve actually mean something. So having police officers live in the communities they serve, have their kids go to the same schools that the children of color were going to was really the solution that she saw. So for her, I really resonated with the idea of having courage despite all the odds that are against you and fighting for this despite not having many people on your side. This is Ramona Lewis. She is the director of Metropolitan St. Louis Inclusion Committee. She's involved heavily in issues of housing inequality, and also she serves as a mentor to the community. With her, I met her at a book drive on the north side of St. Louis, and she very much described Ferguson as being a microcosm of the larger issues of the north side of St. Louis, the north side being predominantly African American and predominantly poor. On the issue of protesting, she very much emphasized that this was a sense of dignity for the community. So being able to have your voice mean something. People who were once designated as invisible were now seen as visible by media and by the community. And that deeply connected to how I felt when I was protesting. For me, I didn't do it for fun or just for connections to other people, but being able to say that that death was not in my name, that the tragedy that was happening around the country was not because of anything I was doing. So hearing that story also connected to her perspectives for leadership. She very much saw the necessity for having more leaders of color in government. And on that, she emphasized that this needs to be fostered through new people coming in and having the educated Black community very much involved in connecting and giving back resources to low-income communities. And funny enough, after we talked for our interview, she mentioned to me that she saw me as a potential leader by just doing my project. So it's humbling and interesting to have that and have that motivation while I was doing my project, having the stress of reliving and going through all these stories with all these individuals. So from her, I take that dignity for leadership. Finally, this is King Azor. He was a Zumba instructor that I met, and he is very much engaged in issues of health in the community. He has his own Zumba company, and he does a lot of workshops with members of the community. And for him, Ferguson was a trailblazer. He saw it as a moment in which members of the community who had once not wanted to engage in these topics were awakening. And for him, that meant Black independence. So having Black-owned businesses, having spaces in which Black people can thrive and share economic means was what he saw as a change. And this really challenged my perception, because initially the idea of Black nationalism can be scary for some. For him, he described it as being less reliant on the systems that oppress you. And in that, the idea that coming together through collective means is what love really means in these communities. So he challenged my idea of love, that Black radical self-love for your community is being able to be less reliant on the systems that oppress you, while also acknowledging the reform that needs to take place. So existing in both spaces was essential for me. And for me, Ferguson was a lot of things. It was healing, it was a catalyst for a lot of things, and being able to have these stories and not just the collective understanding of policy change in this region is what has really galvanized me and was the reason I was on that roof. So having Ferguson, a space of civil rights outrage and a model for many communities in this country, Baltimore, many regions in this country which have risen up against police brutality, and also having the power of Selma, the nonviolent leadership of the movement, of foot soldiers in the movement that I was able to meet with during my time there, was essential to my development and the reason I am here today. And with that, I can say that Selma is now and Ferguson is everywhere.